So good morning everybody. I hope that you enjoyed yesterday's session as I did. Yes. It was a very interesting and stimulating conversation on a very different topics. We had methodology, we had experiments, we had FDIs, we had education, we had religion. So for me it was a very interesting experience, probably one of the most intense academic experiences since I am in Malaysia. And I think Daniel shared the same impression. we had this exchange of messages yesterday. So unfortunately for you, you have also to listen to me today. There is also a presentation from my side. As you have probably understood from the debate yesterday, I have quite a passion for the role of history in economics. And indeed, my PhD was in economic history, and I have taught for 7 years history of economic thought. So that is where I come from. And the theory of my presentation, the first part of the title of my presentation is an homage to a great Italian economist called Paolo Silos Labini that had very different ideas from mine because he's Raffian, but was a student of Schumpeter, and he was used to say that theory is historically conditioned. Okay, and I will use instead the Weberian concept of Verstehen, or understanding, to try to build a link between theory and history. So I think that in this moment we are experiencing two different but related problems. First of all, the teaching of economic history and history of economic thought is basically disappearing from economics curricula. But this is only part of probably a bigger problem, which is the relationship between history and theory, which, as we shall see in a while, is a problem that goes back 200 years. So I believe that the gradual fading of history of economic thought and economic history from economics curricula seems to suggest that the community of economists believes in a clear separation between theory and history. But I wonder if this is a conscious or an unconscious belief. If basically, do economists ask themselves nowadays this question, or they simply accept the separation passively? Now, this big issue, this big conflict between theory and history dates back at least to the Methodenstreit, which was a dispute on methods that took place in the second half of the 19th century between the Gustav von Schmoller of the German Historical School and Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. According to the German historical schools, there is no economic theory at all. We can only have economic history intended as a narration of economic facts and as a collection of statistics. In fact, if you read the German works of that period, you will find mostly collection of data, in particular on public finance and these kind of things. Menger instead argued that economics can have a dignity as a separate discipline. However, what he told was a source of misunderstanding, because he was not denying the utility for history when doing economics, but he was just claiming that economics has a role per se. So somehow for Menger, economics deals with human action and interactions and goes beyond the simple collection of statistics. So the task of economists is to recognize and to interpret the complexity behind those statistics. And indeed, Menger never denied the importance of history for economic theorizing and did not reason in terms of a pure dichotomy between theory and history. So what happened with the Methodenstreit is actually more a misunderstanding than an actual dispute, but was such a strong misunderstanding that no Austrian economist was admitting to teach in a German university up to 1932. So here we are talking about 1880s, okay, up to 1932, so for 50 years, when Schumpeter was appointed with the help of Spiethoff in Bonn University, winning against Mises. In fact, Mises hated Spiethoff because of this. And then we come to our beloved Schumpeter, who judged the Methodenstreit as wasted energies, so as a big misunderstanding that didn't bring any progress to economic science. And we know that if we look at Schumpeter works, there is quite an evolution in his approach. At the beginning, when he was very young, in his first book, Das Wesen, in 1908, he claims that basically we have to do economics like Barras was doing, so embracing the general economic equilibrium. But the more he evolves in his writing, the more we see him embracing instead a sort of economic sociology that was fishing in Weber, in Sombart, so more a narrative kind of economics. And in his latest book, The History of Economic Analysis, published after his death in 1954, he claimed that indeed history is the privileged ancilla doctrine. That means the privileged supportive science for economists. He says there are many other sciences that help the economists, many other disciplines, but he said clearly, if I had to choose only one for my career, I would choose history. Because he said many of the mistakes that are done in economic theorizing could have been avoided if the economist had a better knowledge of economic history and history in general. In fact, he was clearly liquidating Keynes' theory just by saying Keynes wrote things and repeated things that were already written by the mercantilists 300 years ago. So why we should simply take these things as good. And say if Keynes knew history, he wouldn't have written what he did. Now, how did this Methodenstreit somehow evolve and affected the later generations of Austrians and German economists? If we look at Ludwig von Mises, apparently, at least in Hutchinson interpretation, there is the reintroduction, or probably the first really sharp introduction of a dichotomy between theory and history. According to Mises, theory is an a prioristic discipline, and praxeology, that is the way in which he calls economics, is axiomatic, strictly deductive. So economics is grounded on few principles that are always true and don't need any demonstration, and all the theory derive from these axiomatic principles, like the principle of the diminishing marginal utility. This is something in a way obvious, doesn't need to be demonstrated, and all another set of theorems can be derived deductively from this kind of principle. So he sharply, in a very clear way, says there is no possibility for history, for facts, to deny or to falsify any theory. And this kind of way to put things created some issues even within the Austrian schools. Indeed, we have different interpretations of Mises. Mises intended this relationship between theory and history as a distinction or a dichotomy. And Hayek indeed moved in different directions that we cannot really analyze today. What happened instead in the German historical school? Also, the German historical school had an evolution from the time of Schmoller, and the last member, Arthur Spitov, that wrote very interesting things on business cycles, had some methodological writings in which he instead, contrary to his predecessors, he mentioned that there is clearly a theory that is distinct from history. So, according to Spitov, theory can be both historically conditioned, but also genuine theory. The fact that theory is affected by history doesn't make the theory a less pure theory. Still is theory. And he developed what he called an anschauliche theory, that probably in English can be translated as an observational theory. Daniel?
Yes.
Anschauliche.
Anschaulich means that it's easy to see with easy and clear concepts.
So, according to Spitov, we should isolate the distinct features of a certain economic style. So, there are patterns of economic life which have come into being in the course of historical process. So, in any historical period, we can clearly identify certain patterns, certain distinct features that are not only historically in the sense of temporally determined, but also geographically determined, and they identified one economic style. And we can create a theory which is suitable for that economic style. So which is a theory, but is not a universal theory, but a theory that applies to that specific style. So economic phenomena are time conditioned. And I would add, he probably mentioned also geographically conditioned, not only time conditioned. So he, in opposition with Weber, developed what is called also economic gestalt theory, that relies on the real type as opposed to the ideal types that Weber instead developed. So according to him, pure theory deals with models resulting from the isolation of phenomena. And we have to, again, as I just mentioned, to isolate space-time phenomena that have the significance, a certain significance for a specific economic style. So the economic gestalt theory deals with economic reality to the extent that economic reality is unique. So with those unique elements specific to a certain time. And they can change, okay? I believe that somehow we can find a bridge between these different approaches, a sort of mediation, in the works of Ludwig Lachmann, and probably is the right person to do a mediation because he was an Austrian economist, theoretically speaking, but was a German scholar. So he was born in Germany. But he studied under Hayek in London and later became professor of economics in Johannesburg. And in 1971, he published what is probably his main methodological work, The Legacy of Max Weber, in which he tried to reprise the Weber research agenda, calling for what is called an hermeneutical turn in economics. So, with an hermeneutical turn in economics, an approach that I also embraced in my latest works on capital theory, you recognize the importance of Verstehen, which is the German for understanding. So the main tasks of an economist is interpretation. Interpretation is that activity that links facts and ideas. And we have different level of interpretations. Because first of all, there is the interpretation that the economic actors have on their actions, their purposes, their preferences, and about other people's preferences, actions, and etc. But then there is a different level of interpretation, which is the interpretation of the economist. So the market somehow exists also without the economists. We don't need economists for the market to exist as a fact. But as a category, we need the economists. The economists look at the reality of human action and interactions, and see that there is the emergence of a market for exchanging goods, for exchanging information. Okay? So, or the economists observe, as we mentioned yesterday, that a spontaneous order emerged. That's what Adam Smith did. He noticed that intentional actions have unintended consequences. This is an interpretation. Then intended consequences exist with or without Adam Smith. But Adam Smith recognized them as a categories, as a fruit of his interpretational process of the reality that he was observing. So if we follow this approach, we identify economics as a science of meaning. So as a science that look at the meaning behind facts, behind actions. And somehow, in this way, it has the same methodology as history, because also the historian is looking at the meaning, purposes, plans that are behind the facts. The Lachman program of research was reprised later on by Don Lavoie, which unfortunately died early of cancer. But he was one of the most enthusiastic followers of Lachman, and he further developed this concept of interpretative economics, so economics as a science of meaning and interpretation, as opposed to the economics that was during the 90s developing in the Western world that he labeled as objectivism, that is the mainstream economics that we encounter nowadays. And he was saying that economics is a forum for the open contention among interpretations of theory and history. So economics is a forum contending explanations of reality. In this way, he brought into economic science a renewed importance for subjectivism and methodological individualism, because of course it's clear that by looking at the meaning, you have to go to the individual, because only individuals act and only individuals attach a meaning to their actions. Okay? And in fact, the followers of Lavoie later on became known as radical subjectivists. So economic phenomena needs to be explained by reference to the subjective meaning which is attached to them by individual minds. And I already mentioned there are, in this way, two levels of interpretations: the individual's interpretations of facts and the economist's interpretations of economic facts that allow the creation of abstract concepts and categories out of these interpretations. So the spontaneous order is a concept. Also the diminishing marginal utility is one of these concepts. Again, the diminishing marginal utility is a fact even without the economists theorizing that. But the economist is the one that observes the existence in reality of this kind of tendency and behavior. So, out of this dispute and this evolution in economic theory and methodology, we can probably identify a new synthesis. Interpretation and the search for meaning cannot be separated by the very facts to which meaning is attached. So history molds the direction of the theoretical investigation, while theory is used as the interpretative framework with which the specific historical narratives can be told. So is thanks to the observation of history that we also decide our research agenda. But we look at the historical facts thanks to a theoretical framework that allows us to interpret that historical facts. Theory is, in fact, the interpretation of these facts. So history comes to be somehow the supplier of facts, events, actions, and interactions on which later on the economist needs to place his or her interpretational lens. So history also without interpretation cannot exist. Okay, history as a science, I mean. So what can happen, which is the question posed by theory, shapes the way we work on the evidences when we ask what did happen, which is the question posed by history. At the same time, what did happen influences the agendas of economists, orienting the choice among the specific what can happen to be asked. So in this way, if we are going to answer to the question on Mises, if Mises was looking at theory and history as a dichotomy or distinct sciences, we lean toward the distinction rather than the dichotomy. There are two different disciplines, but that influence reciprocally. So if economics is a science of meaning, as I claim, the method of interpretation advocated by Lachmann and Lavoie becomes at least a potential new bridge between historical facts and economic theorizing. So Verstehen, the interpretation, is precisely that link that allows us to see the two disciplines as distinct but interrelated. Thank you very much.